Hi, I'm Gina Barrett, and one of the things I'm known for is making buttons. Today I'm going to show you how to make a button closure for your journals, which you could use any handmade button for. I'm going to be using my button templates, and the first thing that I'm going to do, this can be with a fashion fabric or not, is I'm going to mark out a square. I have cheated and marked out the squares first and the circles first, just so that I don't mess up while I'm filming this. The first thing that we're going to do is work a depression and make the shape of the button mold. So with this square, it doesn't have to be super neat, this, because it's not going to be a square button. This is just to create the foundation. I'm going to fold to make a triangle, and then I'm going to just roll with my fingers to make this into basically a long piece of fabric. I'm going to use a pen because I want quite a big hole in the middle, but this you can vary depending on what you want. And I'm going to roll that around, and then with needle and thread I'm just going to close off that end. And I didn't knot my thread, so there we go. I'll just back stitch. That's just to hold this into a ring shape. I'm going to slide that off of the pen, and you can see that I've got the beginnings of a ring. Now, just to shore this up and make it nice and firm so that we get a nice shape to the finished button, I'm going to flatten it slightly with my fingers as I work and run the thread through the central hole and around. Trying to keep everything in and straight. And keep the center hole opened out, which is going to give the shape. You can see it's starting to become a little bit like a donut. Just snap my thread. So if that ever happens, don't worry, because this isn't the important part. And next time use a stronger thread than just plain cotton. So just finish that off and trim that thread away. We've got a nice little ring shape. The next thing to do is to make a base form, and what I'm going to do with that is I'm going to use a piece of felt, and I'm going to trace around the circle so that it's just a little bit larger than that ring. So again, it doesn't have to be perfectly circular cut out, but the nicer that you make it now, the tidier your button will be. And I've done another out of a stiff Vilene, pelmet interfacing, Visaline. There's a lot of different names for it, but a heavy weight. You could, if you wanted to, and you can't get hold of this for this particular project, you could actually use cardboard, so long as you can get a needle through the cardboard. So those both at the same size. So the first thing to do is get some more thread on my needle. I'm using a sharp needle for this. Because I want to be able to sew through layers, not do decorative work, so a tapestry needle won't really be of any use. And I'm going to center that up as much as I can. And then stitch through. My knot's not holding, just a minute. Let's do a back stitch again. If your knots don't hold, do a little back stitch and that will do it for you. So I'm going to stitch that loosely into place onto the piece of felt. That's so that I can pretty much ensure that it stays central when we do the next stage. And again, make sure that you keep the center of the ring as open as you can. The nice thing about buttons like these is that each one will end up being slightly individual depending on sort of the way that you actually do your stitching. And of course you can, once you've made one, you can figure out ways that you can change it to make something completely different anyways. So taking that, and that's our first foundation shape. Now I'm going to cut a larger circle. So if you look, it's quite a big circle that I will be cutting out. And again, I've just used the gauge. I can sort of make a guess, or I can note down exact measurements to do each of the different circles that I want. So I'll just make that a bit darker so that you can see. And of course you can use any decorative fabric that you want. Cut out the circle. And if you do have a decorative fabric that you want to use and you want to make a pattern, a focal point, make sure it's right at the center of that, because the edges aren't going to be seen in the finished button. So some more thread, and I will start this one with a back stitch because we're going to be doing some gathering. So start with a little back stitch and then work a running stitch around the edge of the piece of fabric. Your stitches here should be fairly small. Basically, the smaller the stitch, when you work a running stitch around a circle, when you gather it up, the tighter the gathers will be and the smoother the appearance. If you make them too wide, you might get a few lumps and bumps. They can be dealt with, so it's not the end of the world. That's my nice side of fabric, so I'll put the good side out and then just gather this up to make it into a little bit of a pouch. And then I'm going to place the little mold that we made ring side down, and then the stiff piece on the top of that. Then gather this up so that it comes around the button, and you'll see you've got quite an unusual little shape there. We've got some gathers, and we don't really want those on the finished thing, but at the same time we don't want to pull too tightly because we're going to manipulate the front a little bit. So if you've got a few lumps along the side, basically you work a spiral stitch going around, gently pulling up just to tighten that around the stiff circle that you created. And that'll just help to smooth off the edges, and you can take a look and you can adjust a little bit until you're happy. I mean, sometimes the ridges along the side will look quite nice and add a little bit of extra character as well, so don't worry about them too much. It really depends on what you want for your actual finished button and the look that you want to achieve. And one more, because that one's definitely sticking up a little bit too much to my liking. Just make sure that's centered up. I'm going to knot this off and then start with a new piece of thread for the next bit. So just get some more thread. Now I'm going to use this double. I was using thread singly, but I'm going to use this double because I want it quite strong for this part. So a good knot at the end. So I'm going to fasten the thread at the back. I'll do a little back stitch to make sure that holds in, and then I'm going to bring the needle up through right to the front. Now you make sure that you use a sharp needle, because going through that stiff circle, if you haven't got a sharp needle, you won't be able to do it. And then go straight back down and pull in so that you make a dimple. You can just fix with a little stitch at the back and then go up again if you need to make a more pronounced, but I don't really need to on that one. However, I've decided that as I've pulled in, I've still got a few wrinkles around the edge that I don't like, so I'm just going to go back again and gather these in so that it's just a little bit tidier on the edges, because that will bother me otherwise. That's smoother. Just got one right there, and as you can see, I'm just moving my needle around to manipulate the fabric a bit so that I can get that lump pulled to the back. And then we've still got a little bit of thread on the needle. I'm going to come back up through the center, and I'm going to put a couple of beads on. I'm using a 6/0 bead here, which has a big enough hole for your regular sewing needle to go in quite nicely. So, and I'm going to put 3. And my thread's broke again. I can't believe that. I've obviously brought a really bad thread with me to do this filming, so let's just take that bead out, trim that off, and get a new length of thread. So it's a case of get some nice strong polyester to do this bit if you're going to be pulling it a lot. And if you, or just be really gentle, which I'm not being. So, little back stitch. First bead. Anyways, as I was saying about putting 3 beads in, by putting 3 beads in, you sort of force that donut in the center to have a little bit of a triangular shape, because 3 beads don't really fit. So you can squash them about. So you could line them up, which would make it sort of go to an oval, or as I'm about to do, put them in as a triangle so that the sides will sort of form into a bit of a triangular shape. You see, you can then manipulate that a little bit more by squishing it, which will give you more of a triangular shape on the face of your button. You can of course add embroidery and so on if you wish. These are bits of fabric that I hand dyed, so I don't really want to put too much of any decoration on it and just leave the fabric as it is. Or you can use, you know, a crazy fabric that you really like. So there's the top of the button. Let's just, and that's all ready. So now we have to do the second part, which is to make the section for the closure. And the closure is going to be based on basically a really long braid. You can use a braid, a cord, ribbon, whatever goes with your journal, with whatever you're actually doing. And we're going to make a second little button, and we're going to put the braid into that. So again, back to the very stiff facing, we're going to do a small circle. Now the circle for the back is going to be just smaller than the button at the top, and that will just make for a neat finish, because then when it's sitting flat you won't really see the join. If you did them the same size, then you'd see your stitching off at the edge. And we also need a piece of fabric that is then going to be larger than that circle. So we'll cut these out. And again, it's the same thing. So long as you can poke a hole in it, you can use card if you prefer. Most of us have lots of bits of card hanging around. Actually, some packaging card makes fantastic button backs, so I have used it often. And again, more thread. And we're going to basically cover the stiff piece with the fabric in exactly the same way as we did for the top, except that this time obviously it's going to create a flat effect, because there's nothing, you know, there isn't that donut shape in the center to distort the button. Getting my tail ends, all the bits I'm cutting off, all over the place. Start with the back stitch, and I am going to do these as smaller stitches for this, because I do want it to be quite smooth at the back, and as I said, the smaller stitches do help you to get a nice smooth finish. And this method of covering can be used for embroidered buttons. If you do embroidery first and then cut out the circle and then you want to cover a button, you can even cover plastic buttons like this so that you can match up with your project. If you don't want to do something really fancy as a button, you can just take a piece of fabric and cover one. You see, this isn't going all the way, it's not covering all the way at the back, which is fine because that will also help to make a smooth finish because I've not got a lot gathered up. So I'll just connect this. It's nice and smooth already, you can see. So I'll just do a few up and down stitches in a spiral, just to make sure that's nice and tight. I'm just going to knot that, but I'm going to leave the thread there. The next thing to do is to poke a hole. Now, the center of the template does have a hole in it, so I can get pretty much a mark to the center. It doesn't matter if this hole is in the center or not, but it should be as close as possible to the center because it will enable your braid to have something to fix around when it's around your journal. So I'm just going to use the tip of my scissors, not catch any of my thread, and just poke through, and then come out the other side and poke through. And then I have a piece of cord. I'm going to thread it through from the nice side, from the good side, so that it comes through. So if you're using a braid, you may need to use a very large needle to help poke through, or if you're using a thicker ribbon. If you're using a flat ribbon, you can also thread those into a large eye needle. It's just basically so that you can get the bits where you want to secure, because you want this to be actually stitched in place so that it's nice and stiff and it stays on there when you're tying up your journals. So I've tied a little knot on one end. That's not necessary always, it depends on what type of cord you're using, but I like it because it just gives a little something to stop it going back through that hole, just a little bit of extra security. But now I'm going to stitch through the braid itself and the edges of this covering fabric, so it gives it something else to anchor to. You can also, if you prefer, if you find this a little bit too fiddly, bring it through and glue it. Just make sure that you use a good glue that's going to hold it there for you. And I'll finish that off and I'll get a new piece of thread for the last bit. So there we have a button on a string, basically. Now we have to put the two together. Get all my tail ends out of the way. So a new piece of thread. I'm going to work very small stitches. Again, at this point, you could, if you really wanted to, you could glue it, but you'll get a much nicer finish if you're doing this sewing. So I'm going to fasten the thread end at the back of the front of the button. Back stitch to hold. I'm going to place the back of the button centrally over, and then I'm going to work from the front button to the back of the button. I'm just working at the edges and little stitches catching as you go, the front and the back. You may, with the thing with glue, you may wish to glue end stitch if you know, for instance, it's going to be a journal that's going to go through a lot of battering. You might want to do that as well, just so that your stitches are, you're sure that your stitches are all going to be nice and tight. Or if, like me, you're using what ended up being a very weak thread, a little bit of glue there is a bit of an extra insurance policy. So just going back and forth. Catching the fabric on both sides. Sorry about the silence. I suddenly go into that when I'm doing lots of fine stitching. Little stitches are a bit like doodling. You just go off into a world of your own, especially when there's stitches you don't even have to worry about whether they're seen or not, so you don't have to worry about how neat and tidy they are. So, full circle. Yep. Take your needle, to finish off, take your needle just where your last stitch was. Take your thread twice around your needle. Bring the needle through, which creates a knot. Then take the needle through to come up somewhere else entirely. Okay, pull on that quite tight. Snip the scissors, and then that end should just disappear and you won't see the thread end at all. So that's your finished button closure, and the way that you use it is to have it on your journal however you want. Wrap around, you can wrap up and down if you want. Basically, however you want to close your journal, it's there to do that and can be used again. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial, and I'd love to see pictures of your button closures.